I'm going to talk a little bit about delivering the goods. And this is about getting the content, getting the web content that you've developed and created out to your users as fast as possible. Now, I know that page load is kind of a well-trodden path when it comes to just web development topics. But I think it's increasingly important with the mobile web, with mobile connectivity. But I also think at the same time, our expectations for what's OK when it comes to page load are just too lax. And I think our expectations for how fast things could be are also a little bit too low. And I like to think about it this way. This was a great post about an engineer's guide to optimization. There's 4 steps. First step, identify a scenario in which optimizing it will move the needle of a business metric. Then, measure the scenario. We're talking about page load, so it's probably going to be a measurement in speed index, but I'll get to that in a second. After that, calculate light speed. What is the fastest that we can get? Considering the physical constraints of bandwidth, latency, capacity, processing, how fast can it possibly be? And then step 4 is approach that speed of light. In the case of network, when it comes to page load, we are actually talking a lot about the speed of light, how fast it takes packets to move across the country, across the globe. But I mentioned speed index. And now, if you're not familiar with that, I'm going to give you a quick primer. It's a measurement on how the user perception of how fast a page loads. So take, for example, Twitter. This is actually the old Twitter, back before they started doing some of the better things that they do now. So down the bottom, we have a waterfall of the general load. And down there is the vertical blue line signifying the onload event. So that happens at about 2.5 seconds. But at onload, the page is not really done. It's a big white page. Down when the network activity completes, about 8.5 seconds, then we do see the content. So somewhere in the middle between window onload firing and the end of network activity is when me, as the user, gets to actually see the content that I'm there to perceive. So another way to look at this. Up here at the top, we have kind of these film strips. So every half second, we take a screenshot, and we take a look at how the page is loading. So this is 3 different levels of optimization on a single page. The first is kind of the baseline. Then we optimize it a little bit. Then we defer the JavaScript execution. But anyways, you can see that clearly things are loading in faster as we come down here. But here is a visual representation of the visual progress of that page coming in with the 3 different variations. This golden line represents the last example. So quick jump up in the visual progress right here. And then we complete it. And this actually looks, to me, I guess, it's a little pixelated. It looks like it's going to probably deliver the content that I'm going for. But then it finishes off, and there's more action. So this is a nice visual representation seeing how the user perception of the page is happening. Now, if we take these visual progress bars and we take a look at the area above the curve, that's basically what the speed index measurement is all about. So we're taking a look at essentially what the time for the median pixel of the page is to be rendered. So this is a really nice way of measuring user perception of page load, because it's not about window on load, DOM ready. It is about pixels being on the screen. That's what matters. So basically, the speed index, high is bad, low is good. You want lower speed indexes. Now, a little bit more recently, David Walsh tweeted this. He said, someone needs to write the definitive page load post on number of requests versus page size. And I agree. I actually made a similar request about 3.5 years ago when I was trying to figure this out too. Do I concatenate? Do I not? Anyways, I'm going to try and answer this now, if that's OK. So I asked some friends, some colleagues. And Steve Souders got back to me. Over at the HTTP archive, they have a bunch of fantastic stats, but 2 of them are identifying the correlation to load time and to render time. And so we can see what is correlated to a fast load time. In this case, we see speed index, total requests, and here's total transfer size. All right, but actually, 1 second. Actually, what we're interested in is actually the correlation to the speed index, as that is the best measurement of speed. So I ran these numbers yesterday. So here we are. The highest correlation is time to visually complete, which makes a lot of sense. And then here's the total page size versus the total number of requests. About the same. Now, requests does have slightly higher correlation, but really not that much. All right. So I think doing the big data approach is not really telling us the answers that we want. So I needed better answers, and I talked to Ilya. So you saw Ilya here on the stage yesterday. And I asked him what he thought. Now, Ilya put it like this. He said, I want to be in good health. I like good health. All right. And he's like, I heard that, eating regularly, maybe more than 3 times a day is good for you, but how would you best optimize that food intake? What is the right number of meals? What is the optimal number of pounds of food per meal to eat? And he's like, this is probably a good analogy for what I'm asking for when I say number of requests versus page size. And it sounds a little silly, right? You probably would not choose that way. Measuring performance by kilobytes is like measuring the effectiveness of your diet by the pound. Measuring by number of requests is like measuring your diet by number of things you ate. Both of these cases are not really what you're trying for. When you're talking about what you eat, it's what you ate. So we need to be a little bit more specific in how we look at this. Not all requests are equal, because some are initiated in different places. They block different parts of the user experience of the page. Not all nutrients are equal. They release energy slower, faster. Some are better for you than others, obviously. And not all bytes are equal. Different content types of bytes, images, scripts, CSS, have different impact on performance. And the first 14 kilobytes of the page are far more important than the last 14 kilobytes of the page. So I'm going to try and communicate 2 things now. How requests work at the network layer, and then also what's in the critical path of loading the page. All right. Since Ilya did such a great job in answering my question and helping me see a better thing, I'm just going to lift some slides from him. So he's going to help me explain some of these things since he's the expert and wrote the book on it. All right. The components of an HTTP request. There's a few things going on. In this example, we are just loading Bloomberg.com. First up, we have to do a DNS lookup. We do that, we get back the DNS information, we do a socket connect. This is the TCP handshake. We're saying, hey, I want to talk to you. Then we make the request, and then once we make the request and the server replies, we actually download the data. So here's where we are actually getting back the data of what is at Bloomberg.com. Now, a standard page, of course, has many, many, many requests. This is yahoo.com. Yahoo has about 50 requests for its homepage, and it takes about 4 seconds to complete. But if we look down at the bottom, this is the bandwidth utilization of the page. I mean, we're not completely filling our bandwidth utilization. We are idling our bandwidth utilization a lot of the time. So we're not entirely bound by the bandwidth capacity here. So what's going on? So this is actually data from Mike Belshie, who was the creator of the Speedy protocol. He looked at how bandwidth and latency affect page load time. So let's say that your Comcast internet actually starts out at 1 megabit per second and then kind of gets upgraded. These are the page load times that you would see as they increase. Start out increasing pretty well. Everyone has 3 megabits or above usually. But after that, the gains are very, very small. Whereas going and decreasing the latency has a much more significant effect on the page load time. And if you notice this yourself, you notice you're watching a video and you are bound by the amount of bandwidth that you have. But generally, you desktop versus your phone on a mobile connectivity, latency is what is bounding your web browsing speed. So why is that happening? We're going to look at TCP and how that works a little bit. Now, I just learned this stuff a little bit ago, and finally it makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm going to try and explain it here. All right. You are asking a server for a file. You need to do this TCP handshake that I mentioned first. So you're like, hey, server, what's up? And it's like, what's up? I'm good. That's the acknowledgement. And then you're like, I'm good too. So we have to have this handshake every single time before we actually start even receiving data. And it needs to go to the server and back. So the ping time between these two, you need to travel that, go back again, and then one more time to actually complete this before you actually start getting any data whatsoever. Then, once that TCP connection is started, you can start receiving data. And the way that happens is TCP Slow-Start. So basically, it ramps up the amount of bytes that it sends you over time. First, it's going to start off and say, I want 4 packets. So you ask for 4 packets. It sends it to you. When that completes, you're like, OK, cool. That's awesome. I want 8 packets now. You upgrade. You wait for 8 packets. You do a full round trip. It comes in. You're like, great. 16 packets? Thanks. Repeat, 32. So what this actually manifests as in sizes is probably about 6 kilobytes, 11, 22, 45. And you see down here, we're looking at the time in milliseconds. Now, this assumes that a single round trip is about 58 milliseconds. That's a pretty decent speed. That's like a good round trip time to like a local CDN probably on a cable internet. But on mobile, it's a different story. Mobile, we're looking at probably around 200 round trip time, and probably worse than that. So here, to get to this point, we're looking at about 800 milliseconds. So totaling up all that transfer, we have just transferred 85 kilobytes in 800 milliseconds. But actually, we had that handshake, which added an additional round trip. So it's more like 1,000 milliseconds. But actually, we had probably the DNS lookup in front of that. So it's more like 1,200 milliseconds. Now, that's not especially great. But the worst part about this is that this is required for every new TCP connection. So every new TCP connection, if you have a request that makes a new TCP connection, you have to go through this entire process all over again of just slowly ramping up the amount of bytes that you send down the wire. So a lot of HTTP data flows. It's small, bursty little bytes. But TCP is optimized for these long, open connections, sending down a bunch of data. The round trip time is the limiting factor here. And so latency is the performance bottleneck for HTTP. You can see this in the connection view. You'll see this in web page test, where you're able to identify for any TCP connection that is reused what actually happens. So here are all the brand new TCP connections. That's why we can see this kind of orange part up in front, and sometimes the DNS request here. So we're establishing those, and then they end up getting reused. The light green, we made the request, we're waiting. And blue here is actually downloading. So take a look at the amount of blue on the screen. There's not a lot of it. We're not really limited by the amount of bandwidth here. We're just waiting on the network to give us stuff. So I hope that answers the question of number of requests versus page size, but it's not entirely that easy. It's more than just number of requests. There's a different sort of request, as Ilya indicated. So we need to understand the critical path. How many people end up finding themselves spending some time on Reddit? Yeah, it's like a bad habit. I just got into it in the past year. It's not good. But oftentimes, my browsing session will go like this. I'll click on a link. It starts to load. It's loading. And then I see that. And then it's just kind of taking its time. And then finally, and then a duck feeding fishies. Good. But that was 20 seconds for me to see the duck feeding the fishies, which is a tremendous amount of time. So what actually happened between me clicking that and seeing the actual content? Identifying what is between your user's click on a link and your user seeing the content that they're trying to get to, that is the critical path. So I'm going to come over here to web page test. And this, we're looking at a similar page from Imgur. And one of the things here, you've probably seen web page test before, but go again, because it keeps on getting added with a bunch of new features. I mentioned speed index before. We can see the speed index value right here. We're looking at about 8,500 for this page, which is it's not good. But a great view of how this page loads is the film strip view. So it looks something like this. We have iterative screenshots taken of the page as it loads. But cooler than that, we see the correlation between the loading and the network activity. So here it's a very direct line to understand how the network assets that are coming in are affecting the user perception of the page loading. So you can see right about here where this kind of the background comes in. That is reflected down here as the big green line coming down. That's the first paint. Then after that, we kind of wait around, as you saw. We're waiting, we're waiting, we're waiting. And finally, we see the image coming in. If I scroll down to see what's going on, here's the image right here. This is the request. And you can see here's our kind of significant download time, actually waiting for the bytes of the image to come in. But the request wasn't initiated until a little over 8 seconds after we asked for the HTML page, which is a really long time. So what was holding that up? Well, what we can see here is actually a few funny things. Why would the request start here? The browser's preloader is actually really smart about prioritizing content that the user wants to see. So if that image tag was actually in the HTML of the page when it first got it, it probably would start, back here when it got the HTML. But it didn't, because what Imgur actually did is it made a request to its API service here. And so the API service is actually on a separate domain, so it had to do a DNS lookup, a TCP handshake. It actually did some SSL negotiation. And this was a cross-origin request, so it did some core stuff. And it finally got the payload of the API call right here. And then the API call was like, oh, yeah, the URL of that image that you want, it's right there. So that's why it started down here. So that's a little funny. But the other part about this is that all these requests up here, including the web font, these didn't start until the DOM was ready. That's because we were waiting on everything in the head to finish completing. This is the CSS, the library JavaScript, and the application JavaScript. So all these things are just kind of holding up, and all the rest of the requests can't begin until that's all set. Here's the proper waterfall view in web page test. Now, one kind of thought experiment here. You often hear about kind of people evaluating JavaScript libraries based on page size. Imagine if instead of jQuery, this page had Zepto. jQuery is actually in this libmin.js. It's about a third of the size of libmin.js is jQuery, and then there's some other stuff in there. If we replace that with Zepto, we would probably cut down the size of this blue bar of the download by maybe half at best. Now, if we cut down the size of that blue bar in half, how much effect would that have on this page? It would have some, probably maybe like half a second. We would start downloading this earlier. But imagine if we didn't block the rest of the page from starting downloading before these JavaScript requests came in. We'd be able to shift this entire block over about 2.5 to 3 seconds. That's a much more significant gain than just making a smaller JavaScript that sits in the head. One more thing I want to show you is that in web page test, you can actually ask it to record a timeline. So if you're familiar with the Chrome DevTools timeline, it will record that data as well. So if you want to understand what actually happened in the same session on a timeline perspective, you can go and take a look and see what were the paints, what were the recalc styles, all that stuff too. So you can get a lot of detail on the exact precise loading of that page. All right, coming back here. So critical CSS is what is the CSS that is required to give the initial presentation of the page to the user. This is a diagram from The Guardian, who's done a lot of optimization around this. They determined that, of course, people come for the articles. So this is the critical CSS. Everything that's above the fold that is required for that initial page view, And so the idea here is that you can actually just send down the critical CSS that is required for the above-the-fold content at the very top of the page. So you'll probably actually inline it in the HTML. And then subsequently, you will include the non-critical CSS separately. That way, you can actually get all that content to the user in the first request of the page and not actually wait on anything subsequent after that. So there's a few good guides here. You want to eliminate any render block in JavaScript. JavaScript up in the head is bad. It's going to hold up the rest of the page entirely. So load all JavaScript asynchronously. Minimize any render block in CSS. Clearly, we need CSS in the head to render things. But you want to minimize it. And you can do this trick of only including what is critical for the above-the-fold content and loading the rest separately. And then deliver the goods. Make sure that you're delivering actual HTML that has the content the user wants to see. If you're doing client-side templating, find a nice solution to actually deliver the HTML in the original response as well. Don't have redirects for the HTML. A redirect for other things is OK. A redirect for the actual HTML is really rough on the users. And of course, gzip. So a quick overview of waterfall patterns that you might see if you're digging around in web page test. You'll see these things. Here, we're waiting on the back end to finally get back to us. Here, you see we're waiting on this big, big request, and we can't actually begin the rest of the stuff. So this is blocking a bunch of the things, and we don't start painting till later. These are large resources. It's probably like a bunch of videos. Sometimes this is OK. But you can see a bunch of big downloads, and the bandwidth utilization is huge. And then other times, we have a bunch of work to do before we even paint this green bar, painting the content. And so we had to complete all that. This is the after. We finally figured out how we can deliver the critical path and get a paint out really quickly. So wrapping up, Google Page Speed Insights is a really nice tool. It's been updated a bunch in the past year and captures a lot of the recommendations that you can do at the network layer and at the UX layer to improve the page load and mobile experience for your users. Some aggressive but good goals beyond what page speed will tell you. You want to deliver a really fast mobile page load, of course. Shooting for delivering that in under a second is a good goal. And that means serving all that above-the-fold content in the first 14 kilobytes of the response. This actually takes advantage of the TCP Slow-Start. So the first packets that come down have all the goodness, and you do not need more round trips. Also, a good goal is a maximum of 200 milliseconds server response time. I think that's a little high. I think we could do even better than that. I didn't talk about render performance, but Paul Backhouse will be talking about that later today. And a speed index under 1,000 is a good thing to shoot for. Anyways, here's some more resources, and thank you guys very much.